November 18th, 1943. A dense morning fog blanketed the rolling hills surrounding the tiny village of Waldenhof in southwestern Germany. Lieutenant Thomas Harrison of the United States Army Air Forces believed he had at least 40 minutes of fuel remaining, enough to reach friendly territory after his damaged B-17 bomber had separated from its formation. In reality, his aircraft would be on the ground in less than 10 minutes, and the hands that would save him belonged to someone he had been taught to hate. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how an act of unexpected mercy during mankind's darkest hour created a bond that would ultimately transform 2 lives and an entire community, revealing how humanity can persevere even in the most divisive times. The morning had begun like any other mission day at Thorpe Abbotts Airfield in England. The men of the 396th Bombardment Group shuffled through the pre-dawn darkness toward the briefing room, their breath visible in the cold November air. Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, a 24-year-old pilot from Wilmington, Delaware, felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten as he took his seat. This would be his 16th mission, still 9 short of the magical 25 that would earn his ticket home. "Gentlemen, today's target is the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt," announced Colonel Richard Davis, pointing to the map of Germany. A collective groan rippled through the room. Schweinfurt had already gained a notorious reputation among bomber crews. A previous raid in October had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and over 600 crewmen. The Germans called it Black Thursday. The Americans called it a massacre. I know," Colonel Davis continued, raising his hands to quiet the murmurs. "But those bearings are critical to their war machine. Intelligence suggests reduced defenses since the last raid. They might not be expecting us to return so soon." Technical Sergeant Walter Dunham, Harrison's flight engineer, leaned over and whispered, "Reduced defenses, my foot. The the Germans, will be waiting with open arms and plenty of flak." Harrison nodded grimly. "Just another day at the office, Walt." As they walked to their aircraft, a B-17 Flying Fortress they had named Delaware Destroyer, Harrison reviewed the mission details with his crew. "Remember, we're flying in the low squadron, Purple Heart Corner. This position, at the lower rear of the formation, was statistically the most dangerous place to be. The men had grimly nicknamed it Purple Heart Corner due to the high casualty rate. On the other side of the war, in the small village of Waldenhof, Margareta Weber was already 2 hours into her morning routine. At 32, she had been a widow for nearly 3 years, ever since receiving the telegram informing her that her husband, Conrad, had perished during the campaign in Russia. Left alone with their 10-year-old daughter, Elsa, Margaret had somehow managed to keep their small farm operational, despite the increasingly desperate wartime conditions. "Mama, look at the sky," Elsa said, pointing east as they collected eggs from the henhouse. The clouds looked strange today. Margaret glanced up. Indeed, there was something unusual about the weather, a thick, soupy fog that seemed to be rolling in from the hills, unusual for this time of year. "Perhaps there will be rain," she said, though something in her gut told her it wasn't just weather approaching. Village life in Waldenhof had changed dramatically as the war progressed. Once a close-knit community of 300 souls, it now felt hollow, with most of its men gone. First to glory, as the early propaganda had promised, and then, as the years wore on, to graves scattered across Europe and Russia. The remaining residents were predominantly women, children, and the elderly, all struggling under increasingly severe rationing and the constant fear of Allied bombing raids. Herr Müller, the 65-year-old village mayor and former schoolteacher, had become the de facto leader of their diminished community. That morning he was making his rounds, checking on the most vulnerable residents and distributing the latest meager rations of coffee substitute and bread. "Good morning, Frau Weber," he called, approaching Margaret's gate. "How are you and little Elsa faring today?" "We manage, Herr Müller," Margaret replied with the stoic resilience that had become characteristic of German women during the war. "The hens are still laying, and the goat gives enough milk. We are more fortunate than many." Müller nodded approvingly. Your strength continues to inspire the village, Margaret. Conrad would be proud. At the mention of her husband, Margaret's face remained impassive, though her heart clenched. 3 years had dulled the pain but hadn't erased it. What would Conrad think of Germany now? Of the rumors that occasionally reached even their remote village? She pushed such thoughts aside. They were dangerous and unproductive. "Any news from the front?" she asked, changing the subject. Müller's weathered face grew serious. "Nothing official, but Heinrich Bauer received a letter from his son in the Luftwaffe. The Americans are bombing deeper into Germany every week. They say Schweinfurt might be hit again soon." Little did they know that at that very moment, Lieutenant Thomas Harrison was flying through the frigid skies above France, his B-17 in tight formation with 23 other bombers from the 396th Bombardment Group. Their mission, exactly what Heinrich Bauer's son had predicted. The ascent to 27,000 feet had been grueling. At such altitudes, the temperature inside the unpressurized bomber plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Despite their electrically heated suits, the men could feel the cold seeping into their bones. Ice formed on the inside of the aircraft's metal skin, and their oxygen masks frequently froze to their faces. 5 minutes to German border, came the navigator's voice over the intercom. Lieutenant Mark Abramowitz, a 23-year-old Jewish American from Brooklyn, had an uncanny ability to find his way through the cloud-covered European landscape. Everyone looked sharp, flak and fighters likely in 10 minutes. In the cockpit, Harrison scanned the sky nervously. The weather was deteriorating, with clouds building up ahead, both a blessing and a curse. Cloud cover might hide them from German fighters, but it also made it harder to maintain formation, and a bomber alone was a bomber doomed. "I count 16, no 18 contrails at 2 o'clock high," reported Staff Sergeant James O'Malley, the top turret gunner. "German fighters, coming in fast." What followed was 20 minutes of pure chaos. The German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters tore through the bomber formation with ruthless efficiency. Flak burst from ground batteries added to the mayhem, filling the sky with deadly black puffs of smoke and shrapnel. Delaware destroyer shuddered as cannon fire from a German fighter raked its left wing, tearing holes in the aluminum skin and damaging the No. 2 engine. Harrison fought the controls as the bomber lurched violently. "No. 2 is losing oil pressure," shouted Dunham, the flight engineer. "We've got to shut it down before it seizes." Harrison nodded grimly and followed the emergency procedure, feathering the propeller to reduce drag. The bomber could fly on 3 engines, but their problems were just beginning. "Navigator hit," came a panicked voice over the intercom. "Abramowitz is down." "How bad?" Harrison demanded, unable to leave the controls as he struggled to keep the crippled bomber in formation. "Shrapnel in his leg," reported Technical Sergeant Roy Peterson, the radio operator who had crawled to the navigator's compartment. "He's conscious, but losing blood. I've applied a tourniquet." Harrison made a split-second decision. "We're turning back. We can't make it to Schweinfurt and home again on 3 engines and with a wounded man aboard." "The formation's breaking up anyway," observed First Lieutenant Daniel Miller, Harrison's co-pilot, pointing through the windscreen. Indeed, the neat pattern of bombers had dissolved into scattered groups as the German fighters continued their assault. Harrison banked the damaged B-17 gently to the west, intending to head back toward Allied lines, but another burst of flak rocked the aircraft violently, and suddenly the instrument panel erupted in warning lights. "Hydraulic pressure dropping," Dunham shouted, "and fuel line to No. 3 engine might be hit, pressures fluctuating." Harrison's mind raced through their rapidly diminishing options. They were deep over enemy territory, with a damaged aircraft, a wounded navigator, no formation protection, and now possibly losing a second engine and hydraulics. The odds of reaching friendly territory were becoming vanishingly small. "New heading 180, Harrison ordered, turning the bomber south. "South?" Miller questioned incredulously. "That's deeper into Germany." "Switzerland," Harrison explained tersely. "It's our only shot now, neutral territory. If we can make it over the border, we'll be interned for the duration, but alive." What Harrison didn't know, couldn't know, was that Abramowitz's navigation instruments had been damaged by the same shrapnel that wounded him. The heading he believed would take them toward the Swiss border was actually leading them deeper into southwestern Germany, toward the Black Forest region and the small, unsuspecting village of Waldenhof. For 40 tense minutes, the damaged bomber limped along, gradually losing altitude, as Harrison tried to coax maximum efficiency from the remaining engines. The cloud cover had thickened, reducing visibility to near zero and forcing them to fly on instruments alone. They had dropped to 12,000 feet to find warmer air and reduce the strain on the engines when disaster struck. "Number 3 engines on fire," Miller shouted, pointing to the flames now clearly visible from the cockpit window. Harrison didn't hesitate. "Shut it down and activate the extinguishers." But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. With 2 engines out, the B-17 could barely maintain altitude. Worse, the fire on number 3 engine wasn't responding to the extinguishers. "We've got to bail out," Harrison decided, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "Radio, send our position and mayday." "Transmitters damaged, sir," Peterson replied. "I can send Morse, but I don't know if anyone's receiving." Harrison made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "We'll descend through the cloud layer. If we can spot a suitable field, maybe we can attempt an emergency landing." The bomber broke through the base of the clouds at barely 3,000 feet. Below them stretched a patchwork of small fields and forests, with steep hills rising to the east. It wasn't ideal terrain for an emergency landing, but they were out of options. "There!" Miller pointed to a relatively flat stretch of land between a forest and what appeared to be a small cluster of buildings in the distance. Waldenhof, though they didn't know it at the time. Harrison nodded grimly. "It'll have to do. Everyone to crash positions. Peterson, make sure Abramowitz is secured." The damaged bomber descended rapidly, its 2 functioning engines straining as Harrison fought to maintain control. The makeshift landing field approached with terrifying speed. At the last moment, Harrison cut power and pulled back on the yoke, trying to bleed off as much speed as possible before touchdown. The B-17's belly slammed into the frozen ground with a sickening crunch of tearing metal. The impact threw the men against their restraints as the aircraft skidded across the field, plowing a deep furrow in the earth. The right wing caught on something, perhaps a rock or a small tree, and the bomber pirouetted violently before finally grinding to a halt, miraculously remaining mostly intact. "Everyone out," Harrison ordered, his voice hoarse. "Get clear in case of fire. Miller, help me with Abramowitz." In Waldenhof, the sound of the crashing aircraft sent the villagers into a panic. They had experienced distant bombing raids before, but never had the war come literally to their doorstep. "An American bomber!" shouted 14-year-old Friedrich Bauer, who had been collecting firewood at the forest's edge when he witnessed the crash. He ran back to the village, breathless with excitement and fear. "It crashed in Herr Schmidt's north field." Mayor Müller quickly took charge. "Heinrich, ring the church bell 3 times, the emergency signal. Frau Keller, go to the post office and telephone the authorities in Freiburg. Everyone else, stay in your homes. There may be unexploded ordnance." But Margaret Weber felt a different impulse. As the village's unofficial healer, she had assisted the local midwife for years before the war and had taken on most medical duties since the village doctor was conscripted. Her thoughts immediately turned to possible survivors. "Elsa, stay with Frau Zimmermann," she instructed her daughter firmly, grabbing her medical bag, a battered leather case containing basic supplies, bandages, sulfur powder, iodine, and a few precious medicines she had carefully rationed since the war began. "But Mama," Elsa protested, "no arguments." Margaret cut her off with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Do as I say. I will return soon." As she hurried toward Schmidt's field, Margaret was joined by Herr Müller and Heinrich Bauer, the latter carrying an ancient hunting rifle. "Margaret, this is madness," Müller warned, struggling to keep pace with her determined stride. "These are enemy airmen. If they're alive, they're dangerous. We should wait for the authorities." "They're injured men first, enemies second," Margareta replied without slowing. "And the authorities are at least an hour away from Freiburg. Would you have them bleed to death in the meantime?" Heinrich Bauer spat on the ground. "Let them. They've been dropping bombs on our cities, killing women and children. Why should we help them?" Margaret stopped abruptly and faced the 2 men, Because this is what separates us from barbarians, Heinrich. Because I took an oath to help those in need. And because I would hope that if our Conrad or your Hans had crashed behind enemy lines, someone would show them the same mercy. Her grey eyes flashed with such intensity that both men fell silent. Meanwhile, at the crash site, Harrison and his surviving crew had managed to extract themselves from the wreckage. Abramowitz was in bad shape. The crash landing had aggravated his leg wound, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. Technical Sergeant Dunham had a broken arm, and most of the others were nursing various cuts, bruises, and possible concussions. "We need to move away from the aircraft," Harrison ordered, helping O'Malley support Abramowitz. "Find cover in those trees, and then we'll assess our situation." But they had only made it halfway to the forest edge when Harrison spotted 3 figures approaching across the field. "Hold up," he said tensely. "We've got company." The crew froze, painfully aware of their vulnerability. They were in enemy territory, injured, with only their sidearms for protection. Harrison made a quick decision. "Miller, Peterson. Get Abramowitz and Dunham to those trees. O'Malley, Reynolds, you're with me. We'll try to talk to them by some time." As the figures drew closer, Harrison was surprised to see that only one was a man of fighting age, carrying what appeared to be an old hunting rifle. The other man was elderly, and most surprising of all, the third figure was a woman, clutching what looked like a doctor's bag. "Do any of you speak German?" Harrison asked his men quietly. O'Malley nodded. "A little. My grandmother was from Hamburg." "Tell them we have injured men and ask if there's a doctor nearby," Harrison instructed. "Don't mention that Abramowitz is Jewish. We don't know what kind of reception that would get." O'Malley stepped forward cautiously, hands raised to show he was not reaching for a weapon. "Wir haben verletzte Männer," and he called out in halting German. "Gibt es einen Arzt in der Nähe?" The woman stepped forward, much to the apparent consternation of her companions. "I speak some English," she said in a heavily accented voice. "I am not doctor, but I have medical training. Where are your injured?" Harrison hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected offer of help. This could be a trap, or it could be their only chance to save Abramowitz and tend to Dunham's broken arm. "Why would you help us?" he asked directly. "We're your enemies." The woman regarded him steadily, her grey eyes unreadable. "In this field you are not enemies, you are injured men, and I am someone who can help. The authorities have been called and will arrive soon. Until then I would not let a dog suffer, let alone a human being, regardless of which uniform he wears." Something in her direct gaze and straightforward manner made Harrison decide to trust her, at least partially. "We have 2 seriously injured men," he admitted. "One with a shrapnel wound to his leg that's bleeding badly, another with a broken arm." The woman nodded and turned to her companions, speaking rapidly in German. The older man seemed to be protesting, but she cut him off with a decisive gesture. The younger man with the rifle looked deeply unhappy, but didn't interfere. "My name is Margaret Weber," she said, turning back to Harrison. "I will help your men. But understand this. When the authorities arrive, you will all be taken as prisoners of war. I cannot prevent this." "I understand," Harrison replied. "I'm Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, United States Army Air Forces, and thank you." What followed was a surreal scene that none of the participants could have imagined when they awoke that morning. In a frozen field in rural Germany, an American bomber crew watched as a German widow expertly treated their wounded navigator's leg, applying sulfur powder to prevent infection, skillfully bandaging the wound, and then helping the village mayor set Technical Sergeant Dunham's broken arm using splints fashioned from debris from the crash. "Your friend has lost much blood," Margaret told Harrison as she worked on Abramowitz, "but the shrapnel missed the main artery. If infection does not set in, he should recover." Harrison translated this news for Abramowitz, who managed a weak smile. "Tell her thank you," the navigator whispered. "Tell her she has the hands of an angel." When Harrison relayed this, a flicker of emotion crossed Margaret's face before she composed herself again. "I am only doing what any decent person would do," she replied. The elderly man whom Harrison had learned was Mayor Müller approached him cautiously. "The authorities will arrive within the hour," he said in surprisingly good English. "I was an English teacher before the war," he explained, seeing Harrison's surprise. "You and your men will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, Lieutenant, Germany still observes the rules of war for captured airmen. Harrison nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir. We'll cooperate fully. As Margaret finished bandaging Abramowitz's leg, she reached into her bag and withdrew a small flask. Schnapps, she explained, for the pain. Not much, but it may help. Harrison was struck by the simple humanity of the gesture. This woman, whose country had been at war with his for years, whose own husband had likely died fighting Americans or their allies, was showing compassion that transcended national boundaries. Why? He couldn't help asking again. Why help us this way? We've been bombing your cities. Margaret's eyes met his, and for a moment Harrison glimpsed profound weariness and sorrow in them. My husband, Conrad, died in Russia 3 years ago, she said quietly. Before he left, he made me promise something. He said, Margaret, no matter what happens, remember that this war was started by men in rooms far away. The soldiers who fight it on all sides are just men like me, following orders and trying to survive. I help you because it is what Conrad would have wanted. Because it is what makes us human in inhuman times. Harrison felt something shift inside him, a perspective he hadn't considered before. These weren't faceless enemies. They were people caught in the same terrible conflict, suffering the same losses. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted his thoughts. The authorities are coming, Margaret said, quickly packing her medical supplies. Lieutenant Harrison, She hesitated, then continued. I hope you and your men survive this war. Thank you, Frau Weber, Harrison replied sincerely. I hope the same for you and your village. Within minutes, the field was swarming with German military police and Luftwaffe personnel. The American airmen were disarmed and formally taken into custody. As Harrison was being led to one of the waiting trucks, he caught a final glimpse of Margaret Weber, standing at the edge of the field, her slight figure silhouetted against the winter sky, watching as the enemy airmen who had literally fallen from the sky into her life were taken away. What neither of them could have known in that moment was that their paths would cross again, under circumstances even more extraordinary, and that the mercy shown on a cold November day in 1943 would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. The interrogation at Dulag Luft, the German Luftwaffe's transit camp for captured Allied airmen, was thorough but not brutal. Lieutenant Harrison, like thousands of Allied airmen before him, provided only his name, rank and service number, as required by the Geneva Convention. The German intelligence officers seemed particularly interested in the new Norden bomb site, but Harrison and his crew revealed nothing beyond the basic required information. After 3 days of questioning, Harrison and his men were separated. Abramowitz, due to his severe injuries, was sent to a military hospital under guard. The others were transferred to various Stalag Luft camps specifically designated for Allied airmen. Harrison found himself bound for Stalag Luft III in Sagan, a camp that would later become famous for the Great Escape attempt, though that was still months in the future. As the prisoner transport train rattled eastward through the German countryside, Harrison's thoughts kept returning to Waldenhof and Margaret Weber. In the midst of this catastrophic global conflict that had set nation against nation, her simple act of human decency had affected him profoundly. He wondered about her life, about the daughter she had mentioned, about how they were surviving the increasingly desperate wartime conditions. What he could not have known was that Margaret was wondering about him as well. The arrival of the American airmen had created a sensation in Waldenhof, breaking the monotony of village life and giving the residents something new to discuss for weeks afterward. But for Margaret, the encounter had stirred something deeper, a reminder that the enemies they had been taught to hate were individual human beings, not so different from themselves. "Mama, will the American airmen be treated well?" Elsa had asked the evening after the crash, as they sat by the fire in their small cottage. Margaret considered her answer carefully. "They will be prisoners of war, which means they should be treated according to international rules. They won't be comfortable, but they should be safe. Friedrich's father says they deserve to suffer for what their bombs have done to our cities," Elsa said, her young face troubled. Margaret sighed. "It's not for us to decide what anyone deserves, Elsa. War makes everyone suffer, those who drop the bombs and those who endure them. The important thing is to remember our own humanity, even when others forget theirs. These were dangerous sentiments to express, even in the privacy of her own home. As the war had progressed, the Nazi regime had become increasingly paranoid about defeatist talk and sympathy for the enemy. Even in remote Waldenhof, there were those who would report such comments to the authorities. 2 days after the crash, Margaret was summoned to the village hall to provide a formal statement about her interactions with the American airmen. The questioning was conducted by a Gestapo officer who had accompanied the military police from Freiburg, a thin, sharp-featured man named Richter, whose cold eyes seemed to dissect her as she spoke. "So, Frau Weber," he said, consulting his notes, "you took it upon yourself to provide medical assistance to these enemy combatants?" "Yes," Margaret replied steadily. "I am the closest thing to a doctor the village has since Dr. Hoffman was conscripted. It seemed the humane thing to do." Humane. Richter repeated the word as if it were foreign to him. "And did these Americans say anything of military significance while you were treating them?" "No," Margaret answered truthfully. "They were concerned only with the welfare of their injured comrades." Richter leaned forward slightly. "Did you speak to them in English?" Margaret felt a flicker of unease, but maintained her composure. "I speak some English, yes, I learned it in school, and my husband and I had plans to visit England before the war. I used it to communicate basic medical information." "I see," Richter made a note. "And this Lieutenant Harrison, he spoke directly to you. What was the nature of your conversation?" "He asked why I was helping them," Margaret replied. "I explained that I was acting as a medical professional. That was the extent of our personal interaction." Richter studied her face for a long moment. "Frau Weber, are you aware that unnecessary fraternization with enemy personnel is considered treasonous under current wartime regulations?" Mayor Müller, who had insisted on being present for the interview, intervened at this point. "Officer Richter, I was present throughout Frau Weber's interaction with the Americans. Her conduct was beyond reproach. She provided basic humanitarian aid while waiting for proper authorities to arrive, nothing more. Indeed, her actions may have saved valuable intelligence assets, as the Americans might have died from their injuries otherwise." Richter's gaze shifted to Müller, then back to Margaret. Finally, he closed his notebook. "Very well, your statement will be recorded. But let me be clear, Frau Weber, your actions have been noted. In the future, should any similar incidents occur, you would be wise to wait for proper authorities to handle the situation." The implied threat hung in the air even after Richter had departed. That evening, Mayor Müller visited Margarete's cottage. "You must be more careful, Margarete," he warned, accepting the cup of ersatz coffee she offered. "These are dangerous times. Your kindness could be misinterpreted." "I did nothing wrong, Herr Müller," Margaret replied firmly. "Right and wrong have become flexible concepts these days," Müller said carefully, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. "Richter has placed a note in your file. Nothing serious yet, but enough that you may be watched." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter draft seeping through the cottage's old windows. "I understand. Thank you for warning me." After Müller left, Margaret sat alone by the dying fire, turning recent events over in her mind. She had never been political. Like most Germans, she had initially accepted the Nazi regime's early successes with patriotic pride, believing the promises of restored national greatness after the humiliations that followed the previous war. But as the years passed, as the war expanded and the sacrifices increased, as rumors of atrocities reached even their remote village, she had begun to question silently. The encounter with Lieutenant Harrison and his men had crystallized something in her thinking. These weren't the monsters portrayed in propaganda. They were young men far from home, fighting because their country had called them to serve, just like Conrad had been. For Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, life as a prisoner of war quickly settled into a monotonous routine at Stalag Luft III. The camp housed approximately 10,000 Allied airmen, predominantly American and British, in compounds separated by nationality. Conditions were Spartan, but generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards. The German Luftwaffe, which ran the camps for downed airmen, maintained a certain professional respect for their counterparts, despite being on opposite sides of the conflict. Harrison's days followed a predictable pattern. Roll call at 800 hours, a meager breakfast of bread and ersatz coffee, various camp duties, attempts to stave off boredom through reading, sports or educational programs organized by the prisoners themselves, another roll call, an equally meager dinner, and lights out at 2200 hours. The monotony was punctuated only by the arrival of Red Cross parcels, which supplemented their inadequate diet, occasional letters from home, and the constant planning of escape attempts, a duty considered almost sacred among the imprisoned airmen. The senior American officer at the camp, Colonel Thomas Jenkins, had taken Harrison aside shortly after his arrival. "Each man has 3 duties here, Lieutenant," he explained. "First, to try to escape if the opportunity presents itself. Second, to help others escape. And third, to be as big a pain in the posterior to the Germans as possible, without getting yourself shot." Harrison threw himself into these duties with the same determination he had shown as a bomber pilot. He joined one of the tunnel-digging teams, helped craft forged documents for potential escapees, and participated in various diversionary tactics to distract the guards from these activities. But in quiet moments, his thoughts often returned to Waldenhof and Margarete Weber. In February 1944, Harrison received unexpected news. The camp's senior medical officer, a captured British doctor named Major William Prescott, summoned him to the camp infirmary. "Harrison," Prescott said, "I've received word about your navigator, Lieutenant Abramowitz. He's been treated at a military hospital in Freiburg and is being transferred here next week." Harrison felt a surge of relief. He had worried about Abramowitz, especially given the navigator's Jewish heritage and what they had heard about German treatment of Jews. "That's excellent news, sir. How is his condition?" "Surprisingly good, according to the report," Prescott replied, studying a sheet of paper. "His leg is healing well. No infection, which is rather miraculous given the circumstances of your crash." He looked up at Harrison curiously. "The report mentions initial treatment by a local German woman that likely prevented sepsis. Is that accurate?" Harrison nodded, a mixture of emotions washing over him. "Yes, sir. A widow named Margarete Weber from the village near our crash site. She provided first aid before the German authorities arrived, probably saved Abramowitz's life." Prescott raised his eyebrows. "Remarkable. Not all Germans would have done the same, especially not by 1944. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know, Harrison. Your crashed B-17 has become something of a local resource for the Germans. They've been stripping it for parts and materials, aluminum, copper wiring, rubber from the tires. Materials are increasingly scarce in Germany now." This information shouldn't have surprised Harrison, but somehow the image of his aircraft being dismantled piece by piece saddened him. Delaware Destroyer had carried him and his crew through 15 previous missions. It had been more than just a machine to them. When Abramowitz arrived at Stalag Luft 3 the following week, the reunion was emotional. The navigator was thin and walked with a pronounced limp, but his spirit remained unbroken. "Good to see you, sir," Abramowitz greeted Harrison with a salute that turned into a heartfelt embrace. "How many of the crew made it?" "All of us," Harrison assured him. "Dunham's arm is still in a sling, but everyone survived. How was your treatment at the hospital?" Abramowitz glanced around before responding in a lower voice. "Better than I expected, considering." He tapped his dog tags, which listed his religion as H for Hebrew. "They knew what I was, but the medical staff treated me professionally. The doctor mentioned that the initial care I received probably saved my leg from amputation." He paused. "That German woman, Frau Weber, she knew what she was doing." "She did," Harrison agreed. "I've been thinking about her quite a bit, actually, about what she said to me." Abramowitz nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange, isn't it? We drop bombs on their cities from 20,000 feet, never seeing the people below. Then you meet one of them face to face and everything changes." "Exactly," Harrison said quietly. "Up there, it's abstract. A target, coordinates on a map, but on the ground." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other crew members who had heard of Abramowitz's return. As they welcomed their navigator back with enthusiastic backslaps and relieved grins, Harrison's mind continued to work on an idea that had been forming since his arrival at the camp, a way to acknowledge what Margarete Weber had done for them, a gesture of gratitude that might transcend the barriers of war. That evening, Harrison approached Colonel Jenkins with the unusual request. The colonel listened with growing surprise as Harrison outlined his plan. "Let me get this straight, Lieutenant," Jenkins said when Harrison had finished. "You want to send a personal letter and package to a German civilian? Do you realize how many regulations that would violate on both sides?" "Yes, sir," Harrison admitted, "but the Red Cross does deliver mail to POWs. Maybe they could deliver something in the opposite direction as well." Jenkins shook his head. "It's not that simple. The Germans would intercept anything addressed directly to a civilian. They might even consider it evidence of espionage or collaboration." Harrison's face fell, but Jenkins continued, his expression thoughtful. "However, there might be a way. We have a Swiss doctor who visits the camp quarterly to inspect conditions on behalf of the Red Cross. He's due here next month. If, and this is a big if, he's willing to bend the rules a bit, he might be able to deliver a letter through Red Cross channels." "Thank you, sir," Harrison said earnestly. "I wouldn't ask, but this woman risked her own safety to help us. I feel we owe her some acknowledgement, at least." Jenkins studied the younger man for a moment. "Write your letter, Lieutenant. Keep it simple, non-political. A human thank you, nothing more. I'll speak to Dr. Berger when he visits, but no promises." Harrison set to work immediately, carefully composing a letter that would express his gratitude without creating problems for Margaret. He was aware that any communication from an American officer could potentially put her under suspicion from her own authorities. After several drafts, he settled on a simple message. "Dear Frau Weber, this letter comes to you from Stalag Luft 3, where I and my crew are being held as prisoners of war. I hope you will forgive this unusual correspondence, but I felt compelled to express my sincere gratitude for the care you provided to us, particularly to Lieutenant Abramovitz, following our crash on November 18, 1943. I am pleased to inform you that Abramovitz is recovering well, largely thanks to your initial treatment, which prevented infection. The doctors here have confirmed that your prompt attention likely saved his leg from amputation. All members of my crew survived and send their deepest thanks. Your kindness in those circumstances was extraordinary and will not be forgotten. In a time when humanity seems in such short supply, your actions remind us that compassion can transcend the artificial boundaries of nationality and conflict. If circumstances permit, I would be honored to thank you in person when this war is finally over. Until then, please accept the enclosed token of our appreciation and my personal wishes for your safety and well-being during these difficult times. With deepest respect and gratitude, Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, United States Army Air Forces." With the letter, Harrison included a small carved wooden eagle that one of the British prisoners, a talented woodworker, had created for him in exchange for a portion of his Red Cross chocolate ration. The eagle, symbol of both the United States and Germany, seemed an appropriate token, a bridge between their nations rather than a dividing line. Whether this unusual message would ever reach its intended recipient, Harrison couldn't know. But the act of writing it, of reaching across the chasm of war to acknowledge a shared humanity, gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since his capture. Whatever happened, he had made the gesture. The rest was beyond his control. Back in Waldenhof, winter had given way to spring, though the change of seasons brought little relief to the village's hardships. Rationing had grown even more severe as Germany's military fortunes continued to decline. News of Allied advances in Italy and massive bombing raids on German cities filtered through official announcements, each setback characterized as a strategic withdrawal or tactical repositioning. For Margaret Weber, the daily struggle to keep herself and Elsa fed and warm consumed most of her energy. The small farm produced enough to supplement their meager rations, but just barely. Every potato was precious, every egg a small miracle. Yet amid these privations, Margaret found herself thinking often about the American airmen, wondering what had become of them, particularly the serious-eyed lieutenant who had looked at her with such surprise when she offered help. In late March, an unexpected visitor arrived at her door, Dr. Anton Berger, identifying himself as a representative of the International Red Cross. Margaret initially feared the worst, that he had come to inform her of some distant relative's death or imprisonment. Instead, to her astonishment, He presented her with a small package and a letter. "This comes to you from a Lieutenant Thomas Harrison," Dr. Berger explained quietly. "He is currently interned at Stalag Luft 3. Margaret stared at the package in disbelief. "The American pilot? Why would he send me anything?" Berger smiled gently. "I believe the contents will explain themselves. I should tell you, Frau Weber, that this is highly irregular. I would advise discretion regarding this communication." After the doctor left, Margaret sat at her kitchen table for a long while, the unopened package before her. To receive correspondence from an enemy combatant was potentially dangerous. The memory of Gestapo officer Richter's veiled threat lingered in her mind. Finally, her curiosity overcame caution. She carefully opened the package to find Harrison's letter and the carved wooden eagle. As she read his words, tears welled unexpectedly in her eyes. In the midst of this terrible conflict, with her own country suffering under increasingly devastating Allied bombing raids, this simple expression of gratitude touched something deep within her, a reminder of a shared humanity that transcended the artificial divisions of war. The carved eagle she immediately hid in a small box where she kept her most precious mementos, Conrad's letters from Russia, their wedding photograph, the tiny pair of knitted booties from the baby they had lost before Elsa was born. The letter she read once more, then carefully burned in the kitchen stove. Much as she would have liked to keep it, the risk was too great. That night, as Elsa slept, Margaret sat by the window looking out at the star-filled sky, wondering which of those distant points of light might be shining down on Stalag Luft 3 and the American lieutenant who had remembered her kindness. "Be safe, Lieutenant Harrison," she whispered to the night. "Survive this madness. We all must survive." As spring turned to summer, the war that had seemed so distant from Waldenhof began to feel increasingly close. Allied aircraft passed overhead regularly now, heading toward targets deeper in Germany. Each distant rumble of bombs brought home the reality that the tide had turned decisively against the Third Reich, though few dared speak this truth openly. In July 1944, news reached the village of an attempted mass escape from Stalag Luft 3. According to official reports, 76 Allied prisoners had tunneled out of the camp in March. Most had been recaptured, and 50 had been executed on direct orders from the highest levels of the German government, a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. Margaret heard this news with a cold dread, wondering if Lieutenant Harrison had been among those who escaped, among those recaptured, among those executed. There was no way to know, and no one she could ask without raising dangerous questions about why an American prisoner of war would matter to her. Life went on in its restricted wartime patterns. Margareta continued to tend her small farm, to care for the village's medical needs as best she could with dwindling supplies, to raise Elsa amid the gathering shadows of Germany's looming defeat. Through it all she kept the carved wooden eagle in its hidden place, a talisman of hope that somehow, someday, the world would return to sanity. Unknown to Margaret, Lieutenant Thomas Harrison had indeed participated in the planning of the escape that would later be known as the Great Escape, but had not been among those who made it through the tunnel that March night. His contribution had been in the forging of documents, his steady hand and attention to detail making him valuable for creating fake identification papers. The brutal execution of 50 recaptured escapees had shocked the camp and transformed the atmosphere from one of determined resistance to grim endurance. As 1944 drew to a close, both Margareta Weber and Thomas Harrison, separated by hundreds of miles and the impenetrable barriers of war, shared a common reality. They were survivors in a world gone mad, each holding on to their humanity in the face of inhumane circumstances, each remembering a brief connection that had reminded them of the essential truth that transcended the conflict, that compassion was not bound by borders or uniforms or ideologies. What neither could have imagined was that their paths would cross again under circumstances even more extraordinary than their first meeting, and that the small acts of kindness exchanged between them would ultimately ripple outward to affect not just their own lives but the lives of an entire community. January 19th, 1945. The eastern horizon glowed with an unnatural dawn as Soviet artillery pounded German positions along the Oder River. In Stalag Luft 3, Lieutenant Thomas Harrison and his fellow prisoners huddled in their thin blankets, listening to the distant thunder that heralded the approaching Red Army. The camp commandant had announced that morning that all prisoners would be evacuated westward within 24 hours, a desperate march in the dead of winter to escape the Soviet advance. What no one in the camp realized was that this forced exodus would become infamous in military history as the Death March, during which hundreds would perish from cold, exhaustion, and malnutrition. That same morning, 900 kilometers to the southwest, Margarete Weber stood in the doorway of her cottage in Waldenhof, watching American tanks roll through the village's main street. The war that had seemed so distant for so long had finally arrived at their doorstep, not with the feared Soviet troops from the east, but with the Americans from the west. As a Sherman tank ground to a halt near the village square, a young officer emerged from the turret hatch. Elsa clutched her mother's hand tightly, her 11-year-old face a mixture of fear and fascination. Two lives, two separate paths during this global catastrophe, yet bound by a brief encounter 15 months earlier. Neither Lieutenant Harrison nor Margarete Weber could have imagined how their paths would cross again, nor how that reunion would transform not just their own futures, but the fate of an entire community. The evacuation of Stalag Luft 3 began at 400 hours on January 20th, in the midst of one of the coldest winters Europe had experienced in decades. With temperatures plunging to 20 degrees below 0 Celsius, Harrison and approximately 10,000 other prisoners were forced to march westward through the snow-covered Polish countryside. Each man carried what few possessions he had, in Harrison's case a threadbare blanket, a tin cup, a carefully preserved half-bar of chocolate from his last Red Cross package, and the journal he had kept throughout his captivity. "Keep moving, gents," urged Colonel Jenkins as they trudged through knee-deep snow. "Stop walking and you freeze to death. It's that simple." Harrison nodded grimly, helping to support Abramowitz, whose injured leg made the journey particularly difficult. "How much farther do you think they'll make us go?" the navigator asked through chattering teeth. "Depends on how fast the Russians are advancing," Harrison replied. "The Germans don't want us liberated by the Soviets any more than we want to be. The march would ultimately cover over 250 kilometers in just 18 days. Men fell by the wayside, some never to rise again. The German guards, themselves suffering from the cold and dwindling supplies, showed varying degrees of compassion or cruelty. Some helped struggling prisoners. Others shot those too weak to continue. Harrison drew on reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. The image of his family back in Delaware sustained him through the darkest moments: his parents' farmhouse, his younger sister's laugh, the golden retriever that had seen him off to war. But surprisingly, another image also gave him strength: Margarete Weber's steady gaze as she tended to Abramowitz's wound, her quiet dignity in the face of conflict. If a German widow could maintain her humanity amid the horrors of war, surely he could find the courage to survive this march. By early February, the ragged column of prisoners reached Stalag 7A near Moosburg in Bavaria, their final destination. Here, conditions were even more crowded and desperate than at Stalag Luft 3, with over 100,000 POWs from various Allied nations crammed into facilities designed for much smaller numbers. Disease ran rampant, and rations were reduced to near starvation levels as Germany's infrastructure collapsed under relentless Allied bombing. "We just need to hang on," Jenkins told his men during a quiet meeting in their overcrowded barracks. "The Western Allies are pushing from France and the Low Countries. The Russians are driving from the east. It's only a matter of time now." Harrison nodded, though time seemed to be the one commodity they couldn't afford. Men were dying daily from dysentery, pneumonia, and simple exhaustion. He himself had lost over 15 kilograms since his capture, his once athletic frame now gaunt and hollow. "Sir," Harrison said quietly to Jenkins after the meeting, "I've been thinking about what happens when liberation comes." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Most men are thinking about going home, Harrison. Back to America." "I am too," Harrison assured him, "but there's something I feel I need to do first, someone I need to find." Understanding dawned on Jenkins' face. "The German woman? Frau Weber?" Harrison nodded. "I made a promise in that letter that I would thank her in person when the war ended. I intend to keep it." Jenkins shook his head slightly. Germany's going to be chaos, Harrison. Military occupation, displaced persons, revenge killings. Not to mention that finding one woman in a small village might be impossible. Records have been destroyed, people displaced. I have to try, Harrison insisted. What she did, it wasn't just medical care. It was a reminder that humanity can survive even in the midst of all this. He gestured around the squalid barracks. I need to believe that means something. Jenkins studied the younger man for a long moment. Well, when the time comes, I'll help if I can. But first, we all need to survive until liberation. That liberation came sooner than expected. On April 29th, 1945, elements of General Patton's Third Army reached Moosburg and liberated Stalag 7A. Harrison and his fellow prisoners, emaciated but jubilant, watched as American tanks crashed through the camp gates and young GIs distributed rations and cigarettes to the cheering POWs. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8th, with Germany's unconditional surrender. But for millions of displaced persons, freed prisoners, concentration camp survivors, refugees, and German civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, the struggle continued. Europe had become a continent of wanderers, all trying to find their way home or establish new lives amid the ruins. For Lieutenant Thomas Harrison, now promoted to captain in recognition of his service, the immediate post-war period was a time of recovery and bureaucratic limbo. Like all former POWs, he was processed through a series of medical evaluations and debriefings before being cleared for return to the United States. But Harrison had not forgotten his promise. "Sir, I'd like to request a temporary assignment to the occupation forces," he told Colonel Matthews, the officer handling his repatriation paperwork, in June 1945, specifically to the American zone in southwestern Germany. Matthews looked up from his desk with surprise. "Most men in your position can't get home fast enough, Captain. Why would you want to stay in this mess?" Harrison explained about Waldenhof and Margaret Weber, expecting skepticism. Instead, Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "Actually, we're desperate for officers with German language skills for the occupation administration. Your file says you studied German in college." "Yes, sir. I'm not fluent, but I can communicate." Matthews made a notation in Harrison's file. "I'll put in the request. The Civilian Affairs Division in Freiburg could use someone with your background. No promises, but I'll see what I can do." 2 weeks later, Harrison received his orders. Temporary assignment to the American military government in Freiburg, responsible for overseeing civil administration in the surrounding rural districts, including a small village called Waldenhof. Meanwhile, life in Waldenhof had changed dramatically since the American occupation began. The feared looting and violence had largely not materialized. Instead, the American forces had established an efficient, if somewhat impersonal, administration focused on denazification, restoration of essential services, and preventing starvation among the civilian population. For Margarete Weber, the initial relief of survival had given way to the grinding reality of post-war existence. Food remained scarce. The village's men were largely absent, either dead, still in POW camps, or in hiding to avoid potential prosecution for war crimes, and the future remained uncertain. Yet amid these hardships, Margaret had emerged as an informal leader in the community, her medical skills and practical nature making her invaluable in navigating the new reality. "Frau Weber, the Americans are requiring all adults to complete these questionnaires," Mayor Müller explained, showing her the denazification forms that would determine each person's level of involvement with the Nazi regime. "They will classify everyone from major offender to exonerated. It will affect what jobs people can hold, whether they receive ration cards, everything." Margaret reviewed the document with a frown. "Some of these questions are impossible to answer safely. Did you ever express support for Nazi policies?" "Everyone attended the rallies, Herr Müller. It was expected, required." Müller nodded wearily. "This is why I'm asking for your help. You were never politically involved. The Americans seem to respect you. Perhaps you could speak to their local commander. Explain the realities of life here during those times." Margaret sighed. "I'll try, but the Americans have their procedures. They see things in black and white, when the truth has always been shades of grey." The next morning, Margaret walked the 5 kilometers to the nearest American administrative office, housed in a requisitioned school building in the larger town of Laufen. As she waited in line with dozens of other Germans, seeking permits, rations, or information about missing relatives, she reflected on how thoroughly their lives were now controlled by the occupying forces, not through cruelty but through bureaucracy. When her turn came, she approached the desk where a young American lieutenant sat looking thoroughly overwhelmed by the endless parade of problems requiring his attention. "English?" he asked hopefully. "Yes, some," Margaret replied. "I come from Waldenhof village. We have questions about these forms." She placed the denazification questionnaire on the desk. The lieutenant sighed. "Everyone has questions about these forms, ma'am. The instructions are clear, just answer truthfully." "But the reality of our situation was complicated," Margaret persisted. "Many people participated in activities not because they believed in the ideology, but because refusal meant punishment." The lieutenant was about to respond when a voice from the doorway interrupted in perfect German. "Frau Weber, Margarete Weber." Margarete turned, startled to hear her name. A tall American officer stood in the doorway, staring at her with an expression of disbelief. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, the serious eyes, the strong jawline now visible beneath a neatly trimmed beard. Then recognition dawned. "Lieutenant Harrison," she gasped. He stepped forward, a smile breaking across his face. "Captain now, actually. I can't believe it's really you. I've been trying to locate Waldenhof for weeks, but with the reorganization of districts and the mapping discrepancies..." The young lieutenant at the desk looked between them in confusion. "Sir, you know this woman?" Harrison nodded, still looking at Margaret with wonder. "Yes, Lieutenant. This woman saved my navigator's life when our B-17 crashed near her village in 1943. He turned to the lieutenant. "I'll handle this case personally. Please continue with the next person in line." What followed was a reunion that neither Margaret nor Harrison could have imagined during the darkest days of the war. Over coffee in the officers' mess, real coffee, a luxury Margaret hadn't tasted in years, they exchanged their stories of survival. Harrison described the forced march from Stalag Luft III, the miserable conditions at Moosburg, and his liberation by Patton's forces. "And you?" he asked. "How did you and your daughter survive?" Margaret's face grew somber. "It was difficult, especially toward the end. Food was scarce. The party officials took the best of everything, leaving little for ordinary people. Then came the bombing raids on nearby towns, the refugees passing through, the rumors of what the Russians were doing in the east." She paused. "When your American forces arrived, many in the village feared the worst, but your soldiers were mostly kind, especially once they saw we were mainly women, children, and old men." "And my letter, the Eagle," Harrison asked. "Did they reach you?" A smile softened Margaret's features. "Yes, Dr. Berger delivered them personally. I had to burn the letter. It would have been dangerous to keep it, but I still have the Eagle. It gave me hope during the darkest days." She hesitated, then asked, "Lieutenant Abramowitz, did he survive?" Harrison nodded. "He did. He's back in New York now. His leg never fully healed, he'll always walk with a limp, but he's alive thanks to your initial care." He leaned forward earnestly. "Frau Weber, I made a promise in that letter that I would thank you in person when the war ended. That's partly why I requested assignment to this region instead of immediate repatriation to the States." Margaret looked down at her coffee cup. "There is no need for thanks. I did only what any decent person would do." "But that's just it," Harrison insisted. "Decency became rare during those years, on all sides." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been appointed as the military government representative for this district. That includes Waldenhof. I'd like to help your village recover if I can." Margaret looked up, surprise evident in her grey eyes. "Why would you do this? Your country fought against mine for years." "Countries fight. Governments fight. Ordinary people just try to survive," Harrison replied. "You taught me that, Frau Weber, when you treated Abramowitz despite the risk to yourself. Now the war is over, and it's time to rebuild. I'd like to start with Waldenhof." The weeks that followed transformed both their lives and the village itself. Captain Harrison established his office in Waldenhof's small town hall, becoming the first American administrator to actually live in a rural community rather than commuting from a larger town. With Margaret serving as his unofficial liaison to the villagers, he implemented a series of practical initiatives, establishing a direct supply line for food and medical necessities, expediting the return of POWs who hadn't been implicated in war crimes, organizing repairs to damaged infrastructure, and navigating the Byzantine denazification process with a sensitivity to the complex realities of life under the Third Reich. For the villagers, Harrison's presence was initially viewed with suspicion. Was this special attention a reward or a more intense scrutiny? But as tangible improvements materialized, steady food supplies, medicines, building materials, suspicion gave way to cautious appreciation. "The American captain seems different from the others," observed Frau Zimmermann, the baker's widow, to Margaret one morning as they queued for rations. "He actually listens when we explain our problems." Margaret nodded. Captain Harrison understands that rebuilding requires more than just new buildings. It requires rebuilding trust. That trust was put to the test in August, when Harrison received orders to oversee the arrest of Heinrich Bauer, who had been identified by witnesses from a neighboring village as a former enthusiastic party member who had participated in the persecution of a Jewish family in 1938. The evidence was compelling, but Harrison was acutely aware of the impact Bauer's arrest would have on community relations and on Bauer's family, particularly his 14-year-old son Friedrich, who had no direct involvement in his father's actions. The night before the planned arrest, Harrison visited Margaret's cottage to seek her counsel. "The military government expects me to treat this as a straightforward case," he explained, as they sat at her kitchen table. "But I know Bauer is one of only 3 adult men who have returned to Waldenhof. His arrest will affect not just his family, but the community's ability to rebuild." Margaret considered this dilemma thoughtfully. "Heinrich Bauer did terrible things, Thomas. The Kaufmann family was well respected in the area. They disappeared one night in 1938 after Heinrich and others from the party visited their home. No one ever saw them again." She sighed deeply. Justice must be served, but perhaps there is a way to minimize the impact on his family and the village. Together, they devised an approach that balanced justice with compassion. Harrison would proceed with Bauer's arrest, but would arrange for his farm to remain operational through a work program involving other villagers. In return, a portion of the farm's produce would support the community kitchen Harrison had established. Additionally, young Friedrich would be employed as Harrison's office assistant, providing the boy with both income and mentorship during his father's absence. The arrest proceeded the next morning without incident. Harrison personally explained the arrangements to Bauer's wife and son, emphasizing that they were not being punished for Heinrich's actions. To his surprise, Friedrich responded with a maturity beyond his years. "I know what my father did, Captain," the boy said quietly. "I have heard the whispers for years. Perhaps it is right that he answer for it." This balanced approach to justice earned Harrison respect not only from the villagers, but from his military superiors, who began to view the Waldenhof model as a potential template for other rural communities under American administration. By October 1945, Harrison had been promoted to major and given expanded authority over reconstruction efforts in the region. Throughout this period, his professional relationship with Margarete deepened into a genuine friendship. They worked together daily, her knowledge of the community complementing his access to resources and administrative authority. Villagers began to see them as a team, approaching either one with problems requiring attention. Some even began to speculate about a romance developing between the American officer and the German widow, though both maintained a strictly professional demeanor in public. The truth was more complicated. Harrison had indeed developed feelings for Margaret that went beyond admiration for her abilities. Her intelligence, compassion, and quiet strength attracted him in ways he hadn't expected. For her part, Margarete found in Harrison a kindred spirit, someone who, like her, sought to preserve humanity amid inhumanity. But both recognized the barriers between them, the recent enmity between their nations, the complexities of his position as a military authority and hers as a civilian under occupation, and the practical question of his inevitable return to America. These unspoken feelings might have remained unexpressed, if not for an unexpected development in December 1945. Harrison received notice that his temporary assignment would end in January, with a mandatory return to the United States for discharge processing. The news hit him harder than anticipated, forcing him to confront the depth of his attachment not just to Waldenhof, but to Margaret specifically. On a cold, clear evening just before Christmas, Harrison invited Margaret to join him for dinner in his quarters, a modest room adjacent to his office in the town hall, but private enough for a personal conversation. He had managed to procure ingredients for a special meal through his military connections: real coffee, chocolate, canned ham, and even oranges, luxuries almost unimaginable to Germans after years of deprivation. "You're going home," Margaret said as they finished their meal. It wasn't a question but a statement, her perceptiveness as keen as ever. Harrison nodded, pushing his plate aside. "Orders came yesterday, January 15th. "Waldenhof will miss you," she said carefully. "You've done so much for the village." "And what about you, Margarete?" Harrison asked, using her first name deliberately. "Will you miss me too?" Her grey eyes met his directly. "You know I will, Thomas, more than would be wise." The honesty of her response emboldened him. "I've been thinking about the future, my future after the army. I studied engineering before the war. There will be opportunities in reconstruction efforts throughout Europe. You're considering staying in Germany?" Margaret asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Not immediately," Harrison clarified. "I need to go home first, see my family, complete my discharge. But afterward, yes, I've been exploring possibilities with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. They need engineers, administrators with military government experience, people who understand the challenges of rebuilding." Margaret absorbed this information silently. Finally, she said, "And Waldenhof, would you return here?" Harrison reached across the table to take her hand. "That depends on whether there's a reason for me to come back. A compelling reason." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotions and possibilities. Margaret didn't withdraw her hand from his, but her expression remained guarded. "Thomas, think carefully about what you're suggesting. I'm a German widow with a young daughter. You're an American officer. Our countries were at war mere months ago. There would be obstacles, judgments, complications." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm not asking for any commitment now. I'm just asking if you would be open to the possibility, to exploring what might develop between us if circumstances allowed." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "When you crashed near our village that day, I never imagined it would lead to this moment. Life takes such unexpected turns." She squeezed his hand gently. "Yes. Thomas, if you return as a civilian, not as an occupation authority, I would be open to that possibility. But you must be certain. Elsa and we've survived too much to risk our hearts lightly." "I understand," Harrison assured her, "and I wouldn't suggest it if I weren't serious. These months in Waldenhof have changed me, Margaret. You have changed me." The following weeks passed too quickly. Harrison worked diligently to ensure a smooth transition for his replacement, a lieutenant from Minnesota who seemed eager to learn the Waldenhof approach that had garnered such positive attention from the high command. Together with Margaret, Harrison documented the village's ongoing needs, established contacts, and created a roadmap for continued recovery. On his final evening in Waldenhof, the villagers organized a surprise farewell gathering in the town hall. Nearly everyone attended, bringing what meager offerings they could manage: home-baked bread, preserved fruits, handcrafted items. Mayor Muller presented Harrison with a carved wooden plaque bearing the village crest and a simple inscription, "To Major Thomas Harrison, friend of Waldenhof." Harrison was deeply moved by the gesture. "When I first came to your village as a crashed enemy airman, I could never have imagined standing here today, considered a friend," he said to the assembled villagers. "You have taught me that humanity can survive even the darkest conflicts, that bridges can be built across the deepest divides. I promise you this: Waldenhof will not be forgotten, not by the military government, and certainly not by me personally. His eyes found Margaret's in the crowd, communicating a more personal promise that needed no words. The next morning, as Harrison's jeep was being loaded with his belongings, Margaret and Elsa came to say their private goodbyes away from public view. Elsa, who had grown fond of the American officer who brought chocolates and taught her English phrases, presented him with a carefully drawn picture of Waldenhof's church. "So you remember us," she explained solemnly. Harrison knelt to her level. "I could never forget you or your mother, Elsa. Thank you for sharing your village with me." When he straightened, he found Margaret watching him with a complex mixture of emotions. "I have something for you as well, Yilmaz," she said, placing a small package in his hands. Inside was the carved wooden eagle he had sent her from Stalag Luft 3. "But this was my gift to you," he protested. Margaret shook her head. "It served its purpose during the darkest days of the war. Now it should return home with you, a reminder of what has been and perhaps a beacon for what might be." Harrison carefully tucked the eagle into his breast pocket. "I'll write as soon as I'm settled," he promised. "And I'll return, Margaret, not as Major Harrison of the occupation forces, but as Thomas, an engineer who believes in rebuilding more than just buildings." "I will be here," she replied simply. "Waldenhof will be waiting." True to his word, Harrison returned to Germany in September 1946, not in uniform, but as a civilian consultant with the International Refugee Organization. His assignment covered the broader Baden-Württemberg region, but he made Waldenhof his base of operations with the organization's blessing. By 1948, he and Margaret were married in a simple ceremony in the village church that had by then been fully restored under his engineering supervision. Their union raised eyebrows on both sides of the Atlantic. Harrison's parents struggled initially to accept a German daughter-in-law and step-granddaughter, while some in Waldenhof never fully embraced the American in their midst. But the couple's commitment to rebuilding, both the physical infrastructure and the human connections shattered by war, gradually won respect, if not universal approval. In the decades that followed, Thomas and Margaret Harrison established a small engineering consultancy specializing in post-war reconstruction. Their work took them throughout Europe and eventually to other conflict zones around the world. Their approach, combining technical expertise with deep sensitivity to local needs and cultural contexts, became known in international development circles as the Waldenhof method. Elsa Weber, who formally adopted Harrison's surname in 1950, grew up to become a physician, inspired by her mother's wartime medical work and supported by her American stepfather's insistence that she receive the education denied to women of her mother's generation. Her specialty: trauma recovery and rehabilitation. When asked about the remarkable journey that had brought a crashed American pilot and a German village widow together, Margaret Harrison would often share the wooden eagle that had traveled from a prisoner of war camp to her cottage and back across the Atlantic, before finally returning to a place of honor in their home. "This eagle," she would explain, "represents what can emerge from the ashes of conflict, not just survival but transformation. It reminds us that even in our darkest hour, the capacity for compassion remains our greatest strength. The bombs may destroy buildings, but they cannot destroy our fundamental humanity unless we allow them to." In 1993, 50 years after the B-17 crash that began their unlikely story, Thomas and Margaret Harrison established the Waldenhof Foundation, dedicated to promoting reconciliation in conflict zones worldwide. The Foundation's headquarters, a carefully restored farmhouse on the exact spot where Delaware Destroyer had come to rest on that fateful November day in 1943. The Foundation's symbol, an eagle with outstretched wings soaring above the artificial boundaries that divide humanity. Its mission statement, drafted by Thomas Harrison himself: to recognize that within every enemy is a potential ally, within every divide, a possible bridge, within every ending, the seeds of a new beginning. The extraordinary story of an American pilot, a German widow, and a small village called Waldenhof continues to inspire those working in conflict resolution to this day, a reminder that even amid the most devastating global conflict in human history, individual acts of compassion could transcend hatred and lay the groundwork for healing. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for their remarkable journey came from Lieutenant Mark Abramowitz, the navigator whose life Margaret saved, who traveled to Waldenhof for the Foundation's inauguration. What happened here wasn't just about one crash, one village, or two people finding each other across enemy lines, he observed. It was about rediscovering our common humanity when the world had done everything possible to make us forget it. Thomas and Margaret didn't just rebuild their own lives. They helped rebuild our faith in what humans are capable of at their best, not just their worst. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.